Very good. Welcome. I'm Jennifer Lakey. I'm the Global Energy Director at World Resources Institute, and I'm thrilled to be here with you today and hosting this important discussion between a number of experts in the field who are joining with WRI and the Systems Change Lab for a conversation on the state of transition for the global power system. This conversation couldn't come at a more important time. As we know, the last few months, we've seen significant indications that we have to stretch and raise ambition in order to ensure that we can transition the world towards a 1.5 degree climate limit. We are at the moment reviewing and all recognizing the importance of the final installment of the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, which was released in March. And it detailed the devastating consequences of rising greenhouse gas emissions and climate impacts. The window for us to address the challenge is rapidly closing. Yet we know that the power system has a tremendous opportunity to demonstrate and to accelerate progress to ensure a safe, livable future for all of the world's people. We're excited to host the conversation today between the World Resources Institute, the Bezos Earth Fund, and Climate Analytics as our Systems Change Lab partners. And this is the second in an installment of series of webinars that the Systems Change Lab will be conducting to focus specifically on transition by transition and the transformations that are required. So I'm going to walk through a few opening slides just to make sure that everyone knows who's on the call today and how we're going to go through our discussion. You're going to hear from a brilliant lineup of leaders who've joined us. Laura Cozzi, the IEA's Chief Energy Modeler, Mohammed Adno, the founder and director of PowerShift Africa, Nandini Das, the climate and energy economist at Climate Analytics, and Nicola Seppi, who's the director of energy innovation at Bezos Earth Fund. We're looking forward to diving deep on discussions today. And before we're going to share with you a little bit about the Systems Change Lab, and let me just spend a few minutes reviewing where we are in the power sector and in the energy systems transition. So we'll come back to our fireside chat with Laura Cozzi and to the panel in just a few minutes. So the Systems Change Lab recognizes that it's time to think differently about the way that we tackle climate change and the way we think about the human and natural systems that are required to help us secure our affordable, reliable, clean energy system of the future. We are going to need to think about how to monitor, how to communicate, and how to engage communities on action to protect people on the planet. So Systems Change Lab looks at those data, the tipping points that are before us, and reviews where and how we can spur transformational change. Go to the next slide, please. The power system in particular helps us to imagine where and how action is moving forward. And we do so in the backdrop, recognizing what a significant lift it is to overcome the challenges we've seen in our path for this transformation, whether that's from the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the ongoing COVID-19 pandemics, all the way through to the questions associated with whether our supply chain constraints were going to significantly impact the pace and scale of the transformation. We know that power accounts for a third or so of global greenhouse gas emissions. And to limit warming, we will have to focus this sector in particular on its actions towards 2050. We're evaluating how we get there, and we'll be talking through many of those questions today. But we know that it will take more than replacing existing fossil fuel infrastructure with renewable energy generation. It requires that we think about how much energy our economies demand, how we build infrastructure out in an equitable way, and how we fund the investments that are needed to ensure that we can manage that system in recognizing the different attributes that a renewables-based system brings to us. That means we have to focus on not just the power sector, but what the power sector does in combination with the rest of our economy. How do we ensure that transportation is decarbonizing? How do we ensure that industry is decarbonizing? And how do we link the opportunities for those decarbonization pathways with the need for us to focus on people, on land use choices, on jobs, and on making the clean energy economy a part of everything that a country is doing in doing its economic development planning. So when we recognize the need for this transition, we are looking at a variety of different indicators. And those of you who have been on the Systems Change Lab website, you know that for each system, we have multiple indicators and multiple shifts. Over 70 critical shifts across our major systems are documented on the Systems Change Lab. If you have not spent time looking through those, we would invite you to do so at this time. We can dig deeper on each of these shifts, including the need for us to focus on the scaling up of renewable generation and clean energy generation, zero carbon generation. Also, these other shifts we talked about around the power grids. And in the chat today, we've linked to those specific transitions. So we invite you to take a look at those transitions in more depth at your leisure. But as we think about the power sector, we know that there is going to need to be a whole of society engagement, policy, investment, technology, and consumers thinking about demand and how we will build that transition and how we get social acceptance and how we be inclusive and as we do that. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Our recognition about the targets associated with that transition, and I know that the image on this slide is very small and the text is very small, and it gives you a sense of whether and how we are on track and where we need to go in thinking about the progress towards our targets. So we have aligned this transformation with the Paris Agreement in order to ensure that the timelines associated with the changes are consistent and are thinking through where and how we need to change those indicators. So for example, the number of people without electricity continues to drop over the last 2 decades, but we know that because of the challenging COVID response and the energy strain that we've seen as a result of the invasion of Ukraine, that we have to redouble our efforts in order to achieve universal access. Current efforts will need to accelerate 1.6 times in order to ensure that we can reach our goals around energy access by 2030. Enablers and barriers. Let me just say that in the Systems Change Lab work, we recognize both the important encouraging signs of progress and the categories of factors that enable or impede the change to creating a durable transformational shift. Not just a blip, not just a short-term surge in investment, for example. But I want to recognize that we have to have political leadership. It's not just about tracking the numbers. It's about recognizing and empowering leaders to use this data, to use this information, and to structure their economies. For example, between 2019 and 2021, we knew that solar generation grew by 47%, wind grew by 31%. And the indicators that we've looked at, you can see how the data, how that plays out across the Systems Change Lab data. For example, governments have put regulations in place to incentivize the deployment of renewables and to support energy companies to create scalable strategies. So we know that now renewable technologies are competing against fossil fuel power generation on a playing field that indicates cost-wise in many major economies, we know that those technologies can compete. But one of the leading analysts who's looked at all of these trends is with us today. And so I'm going to ask if we could have Laura Causey join us in the discussion. Laura and I have decades of work trying to help create change, review the data, and steer policy leaders around the world in terms of how they can take action. So Laura, welcome.
Hi, Jennifer.
Laura's part of IEA's senior management team and was appointed the chief modeler, energy modeler in 2018. And she oversees the agency's work on outlook and forecasts. She is responsible for the World Energy Outlook, which is the IEA's flagship publication, and I'm just thrilled to have her with us today.
Hi, Jennifer. Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here with you.
Wonderful. We know you just released a new report on key actions needed to keep within reach of the Paris Agreement's targets for limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. What needs to be done right now, Laura, to strengthen this action and put the world on a credible pathway? What are your opening words of advice for us?
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Actually, we prepared this report as a background document for the Major Economies Forum that President Biden has actually convened on the 20th of April. So why did we do the report? You may remember that we actually did a net zero analysis a couple of years ago. And since then, you mentioned the IPCC report, and we have heard convergence of different voices saying that 1.5 is actually becoming out of reach for a number of reasons. And we actually felt that it was important to reestablish that it's not the moment to say that 1.5 is impossible. Actually, we have never been as close as today. On one hand, because when you put all the pledges together, the net zero pledges together, the world has put forward, and you believe that the world leaders will actually implement them and industry will implement them and consumers will implement them, we actually find that we could limit global warming to 1.7. And this is already something that it's new. It has never happened before. So this gives us a big reasons for hope. The other part is, however, that is not 1.5 yet. And this decade is really the critical one. And we should really focus from now to COP at the end of this year on what are the critical actions that we need to unlock. And the four we determined, three of which are in the energy sector, are the following. I'll go first with the one that is not about the energy sector, is about deforestation. I will not touch upon it. I know you do work on that too. Hugely important. Limiting deforestation and stopping it by 2030 has to be a huge priority. But we focus on the energy sector part. First and foremost is ensuring that we are on track to reach net zero by 2050 with actions to 2030. And I want to mention basically two. One is tripling renewable capacity from today's level. And the second is doubling the rate of energy intensity. And this can be done mostly through electrification. We are doing incredible things on electric vehicles. We are doing incredible things on heat pumps. We just need to continue this. So it's about technologies that we currently have. It's about deployment and putting together all our efforts to ensure that this deployment is accelerated. And we are doing already quite well. So this is the first action item. The second is about everything that doesn't have to do with CO2. And why is it so important? Is because I heard, and I think this is a very good way to label them, methane HFCs are like CO2 on steroids. And those, especially over the next decades and the next 20 years, we need to do everything possible to limit those, because if we go above 1.5, which is possible for a few years, those are really the elements that will manage this overshoot to be as small as possible. And here again, we do think that the oil and gas sector has a leading role. Our analysis shows that we could cut emissions from methane from this sector by 75% to 2030, most of it and at zero cost. So this is for us the second big area in which we need really to coalesce from now to COP. And the third item is about carbon capture and storage and direct air capture. So before we go into misunderstanding the role of CCS and DAC, the first two actions in tripling renewable and doubling energy intensity, them by themselves account for over 80% of the emission reduction we need. However, there are some tech sectors for which is more difficult. Cement is an example. Aviation is an example. So there is a tail of emissions that may remain. So we need to tackle this tail of emissions in those hard-to-abate sectors. So the need for CCS is very focused, is very specific, is complementary to all the other actions we need to do. But we still see that action on CCS has been lagging behind. And again, oil and gas sector, which last year had profits, incredible profits of 4 trillion, could actually put some of this amount to ensure that CCS becomes available for those tail emissions that we are not able to tackle. So these were the four action points that we mentioned in the latest paper.
That's such an important point. Specifically, I'm referring to the need for these near-term actions and the fugitive emissions, the opportunities to focus on everything that's not CO2 to allow us to navigate what we think may be an emissions overshoot to bring us back to a temperature rise that's within the band that we need to ensure a safe future. So I'm wondering about how the power sector plays into that. So we've got this adoption of wind and solar that's come forward. We know that your CEO, Fatih Birol, recently authored an op-ed that is focused on clean energy moving faster than you think. Let's spend a minute really focusing in on the power sector shifts and what the IEA does to help enable that change and how the work is able to be implemented or taken forward on a country-by-country basis. What makes you optimistic about that transition as you're doing your work?
Jennifer, first of all, is data. When we look at what has happened last year, we clearly have all the indicators that show us that the global energy transition, as we say it, have been supercharged. And the power sector is front and center in all this. So if you look at a few of the data for last year, solar capacity addition grew 40%. This is 2022. In 1 year, 40% new solar capacity additions. Nuclear capacity additions grew as well, 40%, similar number. At the same time, we had electric vehicles, so the electrification part of the economy that goes hand in hand with decarbonizing the society and decarbonizing the power sector, also grew an exceptional 55%. So we really have all heat pumps, a critical enabler of heat decarbonization, grew at a level that is nearly on track of what we would need for a net zero trajectory, so more than double-digit growth. So we have all the data that point in the direction of a very, very fast acceleration of the power sector. We have been tracking, in particular, clean energy technology manufacturing, and again, last week for the G7, we tracked solar, and again, the solar pipeline of new projects from now to 2030 would be enough to meet what we need to be fully aligned with a net zero by 2050 trajectory. So I think that there are plenty of very optimistic signs.
That's a remarkable statistic that the pipeline for solar is already able to get us to 2030 from the solar portion of that. And the questions are then, of course, what do we do to create the enabling conditions for that pipeline to materialize and to be deployed in the time frames that are needed? And I think that's important when we look at the questions around deployment. The policy environment is so important. And we've seen significant movements in the last year and 2 years, both the Repower EU plan and the US Inflation Reduction Act, which are reshaping both the economics and the recognition of the supply chain constraints, the need for us to think systematically at how we're going to unlock these opportunities for businesses, for vehicle electrification, for homeowners and businesses. Where and how do you see that policy environment evolving, Laura? I mean, you've managed both the data on the technology side and what's happening, and you also look at that policy implementation piece.
Yeah, absolutely, Jennifer. And clearly, you mentioned two incredibly important policies. Our executive director Fatih Birol, who you mentioned earlier, has defined the Inflation Reduction Act the most important climate change policy after the signature of the Paris Agreement. And this is exactly what we are seeing, an incredible mushrooming of new investment in clean energy technologies, an incredible array of new clean energy technologies that are being activated by the IRA. We are in a similar situation with the REPowerEU in Europe, with the record level of deployment of solar, wind, etc. So if we focus on the power sector, I would say that there are probably two areas where acceleration is still be needed, and I would differentiate it probably for advanced economies and emerging economies. For advanced economies, if the policy is in place, we're seeing a lot of new project pipeline coming. The area where we need to accelerate is probably grids. The tripling of renewables will need at least a doubling of grids investment. If you look at the investments over the past several years in grids have been relatively stable. We really need to accelerate this part of the infrastructure construction that has been lagging behind, frankly speaking, in several economies in the world, including advanced economies. In the emerging world, what we are actually seeing is a different story. In China, China remains the largest market for renewables, the largest market for new solar production. So we're seeing installation going very well. But in the rest of the emerging economies, the story is different. When you look at the amount of clean energy investment since the signature of the Paris Agreement, it's been relatively flat. And this is really the area of the world where we need to wrap up investment. And you look at why we see two fundamental reasons. The first is that the cost of capital for clean energy technologies is much, much higher than what we see in the US, in Europe. And this is actually disincentivizing new investment. They are not coming to the rate and the level we would like to see. We have been working very recently. So this is one very important area that needs to be unblocked, looking at the cost of capital for clean energy technology, for solar, for wind, and doing this systematically to ensure that the flow of capital goes into emerging economies, which is really the area that is most needed. The second, we've been working very closely with Indonesia last year that achieved something very important, which is the closure of the Just Energy Transition Partnership with the power sector at its center. And we work very closely with the Indonesian government. And when you are working on the ground, there are very hard facts. So the cost of capital on one hand, and there are two other areas that with the Indonesians we try to work with. There are a lot of take or pay agreements with existing coal plants that are costly, and someone needs to pay for it. So the international community needs to work together to help those countries that are locked into this type of contracts to help transitioning away from those costly coal contracts. The other part is, if you need to ramp up the clean energy alternative, there is very little pipeline of viable projects. So we need to work on these three areas to really make sure that the emerging economies start seeing the type of rise and takeoff that we have been seeing in Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere.
We've seen very similar challenges in the work that World Resources Institute has been doing within our energy context. And I know that I had the pleasure of working very closely with IEA, especially in Indonesia a number of years ago, trying to build out the idea of energy productivity and building codes and trying to ensure that we have the opportunity to really articulate what does that clean energy economy of the future look like, so that you know what technology and how to bring it in. And certainly the demand side actions, in addition to the policy frameworks that you've described, need to be brought together for that whole of economy transition. And I'm really struck by that cost of capital challenge that you've laid out. I know that IRENA also released a report quite recently highlighting the findings around the costs of capital that they've also documented. And that we did a report last year called Our Solar Future, which looked at how the International Solar Alliance might be able to help support countries specifically on their agendas for thinking through the solar deployment and solar scaling strategies that need to be done, and tackling those questions of investment and technology availability, which are also something that we know is causing some hiccups around the world right now, and some of the supply chain challenges that we've seen. But I want to go back to this question of energy productivity really quickly, and the big picture of how you're building that work, and ask you, Laura, if you could comment on how this comes together, and in particular, I see an opportunity for it to come together in Spain this October. IEA is co-hosting with the government of Spain a conference, a summit that's going to bring policymakers together. And it seems quite well timed to this, both the global stock take that's going to happen at COP28 and the need for us to build a reflective process to work together to address those challenges that we're seeing, and to create the positive momentum going in and coming out of COP28 that's so essential. Tell me a little bit about where you hope that conversation will land, and how you can bring your voice to create this view of that whole of society transformation that you've outlined, both with the immediate action, with the need for addressing these barriers, such as the cost of capital, and both this grid infrastructure build out to complement renewables, and the energy productivity, the efficiency of that transition.
Thank you, Jennifer. In fact, you're actually really, in a way, plotting what is the journey that we are seeing at the IEA from now to COP. So, first of all, in just a couple of weeks, we are hosting this time in France a global energy efficiency conference, where we are hoping some agreement will come out of governments in terms of hopefully being really aligned with this doubling that we need, that you mentioned in terms of energy productivity or energy intensity, the way you want to look at it, but it's really this doubling that we need to see from now to 2030. So this is a very important piece. Another piece is going to be towards the end of June, just ahead the Macron Summit on Finance. We will release, together with the International Finance Corporation, really looking at the element of financing in emerging economies, and how do we bring the private sector capital on the table. So we'll have this part of the recipe while going towards COP. In September, we will importantly release around the UN Climate Action Summit, the updated Net Zero report. And I think this is important. Why we did the Net Zero report 2 years ago. Since then, we've seen two different trends. On one hand, emissions remaining high, but on the other hand, we are seeing this incredible new pipeline of clean energy technology projects. And we want to rerun all our analysis and see what has changed. And this will actually constitute the basis of the discussion of the 2nd of October meeting, where we are hosting, together with Spain, who is going to have the EU Council presidency. We want to bring together energy ministers, but also other voices within the energy sector, to bring to COP the voice of where we are when we look at the situation globally, and what actions at COP we need to bring to keep the 1.5 alive. So in a nutshell, this is the idea of this conference: fact-based analysis that we will bring forward, and bringing together the ministers from the energy sector to give the COP presidency the message from the energy voice towards COP. We can't hear you, Jennifer.
Thank you. It always happens at least once, right? Thank you so much for all those insights, and for what you're doing at IEA to bring all of this forward. And speaking of voices, we have some amazing voices and leaders who are going to join us now as we move forward. I do want to make sure that folks on the question and answer portion recognize that you can type in questions and answers into the Teams chat, and that we will be capturing those and trying to ensure that folks get the opportunity to review it. My panelists, we may not have time for everyone to have their questions answered, but we at WRI on the back end will take these questions and make sure that we respond to all of you as we conclude the seminar today, even if we can't answer them live. So let me ask, if we could, really quickly, as the panel is going to join us, one quick question to you, Laura, that came in from our panel, from our audience, around permitting. And there's been a lot in the news about permitting and the challenges. And Sophie Bordat has asked about the questions in permitting that we're seeing and consumer level adoption, and where and how we're seeing those tensions coming into play in the transition.
This is completely right. Certainly, I can say for Europe, this has been critical throughout last year. The pipeline of projects was much larger than the ability of governments to actually have permitting done at the fast pace. Regulations has been passed to accelerate the permitting in Europe under crisis, but I think we really need to review, because the crisis needs to become actually a permanent fixture. The type of renewables addition we have seen last year in Europe is the baseline we should be seeing in the future. I add to the permitting itself of renewables, the permitting for grids and infrastructure, it has to become front and central. And here, I think the ability of policymakers to engage with communities everywhere is going to be absolutely essential to explain that this is needed, why is it needed, and what will be eventually the benefits for all consumers in terms of affordability, in terms of energy bills, and in terms of overall energy security, beyond the climate benefit.
Yeah, so important. And I know that we have panelists who are also very experienced in this grids question. So this is a perfect moment for us to segue to the panel and bring in the Mohamed Adno, who is the founder and director of PowerShift Africa, which he formed in 2018 to mobilize climate action in Africa and to shift the climate, energy, and economic conversation to focus on zero carbon in development. He's an international climate policy expert and an ardent advocate for people who are disproportionately affected by climate change and who will need to have access to technologies and to solutions that are just playing out in the rest of the world. People who, by the way, emissions have not contributed to the problems to this point. So we really welcome Mohamed to the conversation. Thank you for your leadership, and we're looking forward to hearing more. I'm also welcoming Nandini Das, who's a climate energy economist at Climate Analytics, and we welcome her work focusing on projects in implementation of climate goals at the national level. Dr. Das's research interests have included energy transition and the complexity of South and Southeast Asia transitions, and shaping the impact on socioeconomic development in the region. So looking at both those positives and negatives, where and how to manage the transition, and critically looking at one of the fastest growing sets of countries and the challenges that their economies are going to face in creating a clean energy system. And then finally, but certainly not least, we have Nicole Seppi, who is the Director of Energy Innovation at Bezos Earth Fund. And I love the idea of being a Director of Energy Innovation. Nicole, that's just an amazing perch for you to look at and all of this with. And Nicole, as I mentioned, it has that bird's eye view because she has previously worked in Engie, which was a leading global energy company. And over 12 years, she was the senior executive advisor and managing director for operations and performance for global transformation. So we have no one more equipped to tell us about what it's like to try to make this all happen. Nicole serves on advisory committees for industry. She's on a number of boards, and she focuses on accelerating solutions for the energy transition. So we're going to open up with a few questions that I have for each of them. And my list of questions is incredibly long. We won't get to all of it, but I promise to leave time for all of you to have your questions answered. And so I'm very, very eager to jump in and really have a chance to explore some of these themes that Laura has brought up, and with great gratitude. Thank you, Laura, for for joining us for the fireside chat portion and to allow us to set the scene so well for, I think, what is now going to be a series of perspectives that can really help to bring this to life in very concrete examples of what's happening around the world. So let me ask Nicole if you could start us off, because Laura and I just ended on these questions around the actions and the transition and the grid and permits and where we are. Let's take a look from, you've been in the private sector, for policymakers building out this electricity generation resources and thinking about the types of delivery requirements for that different type of energy system. How do you see the challenges of transformation, and how do we do this grid investment, this grid build out, and the distribution that's required? Where are we, and how do you see that playing out?
Certainly, and thanks Jennifer and team for having me from the Bezos Earth Fund. So I think it's important when we talk about power grids and electricity distribution, we also need to look at it in the terms of the bigger, wider ecosystem. So that's obviously also made up of various renewables. Now, the good news is obviously we're seeing renewable energy booming, which is fantastic, but the needs is not doing sufficiently. We need to triple it by 2030 to actually meet these climate targets. Now, last year, globally, the industry added about 300 gigawatts of renewables to the grid, where green energy is now about 40% of installed capacity worldwide. However, we need to target and hit more about 1,000 gigawatts annually in renewable development to really directly keep this 1.5 degrees Celsius, and we're not on track. Now, in keeping that in note, we must also look at the core framework. And that's the infrastructure, that's the power grids, the distribution systems, and especially in their current system, in their current form and the levels of operating efficiency, directly unable to support this fully build out in what we want to build out in this new energy system. And that's aiming to achieve a core renewable sector. The reasoning is that the current system, especially the global power grids today, still largely based and in fact operated off largely still on the old system approach, where the operating model in the past had always assumed a percentage of baseload coming from some form of fossil fuel. These systems were historically not in the past or even originally designed or foreseen to run a 100% renewable system. And that's a basic fact, but we must not forget that. Institutional, professional, political leaders need to really increase to work together to now also look to build a new energy system, which includes not only building out to increase renewables, but also designing what I like to call the next generation power grid. We must not leave it for another decade before we increase the industry's focus of time, including funding, to bolster the power grids and the distribution systems. We need to really focus on this now, including in the addition of more renewable development. But I would say, especially at the Bezos Earth Fund, we're very much focused on removing the barriers to these key transformations. So in addition to increasing attention to these more innovative solutions to both the design and the future operation of this power grid and the electricity distribution system, let's just look to solve these issues for today. Let's not just look at what's happening today, but instead let's go further. We need to think about the new models, the structures, the solutions for building that ultimate energy system that we want to deliver at the end here. As the system, especially the power grid that is needed to support this net zero world, is different. We must acknowledge that. And it requires increased innovation. It requires different solutions to the form and design that exists today. But it's important to note, and thanks to the System Change Lab, it highlights that recent data showing that the investments in the transmission grids have been flat and declining. In 2016, there was over about 104 billion of capital allocated to transmission grids. This reduced down to 91 billion in 2020 and continued to reduce last year. Further, the investments in distribution grids have been falling since 2016. In 2016, the investments in distribution grids reached about 203 billion. It decreased to 168 billion in 2020 and again reduced last year. So what I would say is we need to consciously look when we're wanting to achieve this energy transition to also balance up and weigh up our focus in terms of not just increase of the renewable development, which is very important, but also the design and implementation of the next generation power grids and distribution systems, but also keeping in mind we need to build the system and the model and the solutions for the future system and not just serving the issues we see today.
So important, and that question of distribution grid it certainly plays out in the ability for us to navigate as well the electrification of transportation, which we know in particular is going to need that robust distribution grid, as will any distributed renewables that we're thinking about in order to advance the system. So really, actually very important to transition from that space to thinking about how that plays out in country. Mohammed, I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about the African voices in this space. I mean, we've already highlighted the difference in the cost of capital that is faced by many economies that you're working with. And I know there's been questions in the Q&A as well to this about the cost of capital and what plays out. But tell us a little bit about how PowerShift Africa is helping mobilize climate action and bringing those African voices into the conversation, because these fundamental questions of the pace, the scale, the accessibility of technology, who has access to those technologies, and where and how our utility systems in different countries face different challenges. Mohammed, can you tell us a little bit about your work in this space?
Thanks, Jennifer. I think, firstly, let me just say that, we are an independent, Pan-African organization, and a think and do tank that is focused on promoting climate and sustainable energy policies. And we do this through strategic, political interventions and engagements so that we can be able to mobilize climate action in Africa, but also leverage Africa's voice internationally. If you look at the world, the continent of Africa currently stands on the cusp of transformative development. This is the youngest continent that is finally coming of age. This will bring exciting opportunities and equally great expectations. And our continent has many structural challenges. You can't deny those. Hunger, poverty, conflict, the debt distress, the limited energy access challenge. We have almost 2 out of 3 Africans without electricity, almost 90% of the continent lacking clean cooking, and these things are hampering progress. But there's also immense potential. We have clean energy resources and a predominantly youthful population, and if you look at the opportunity for this continent to offer greater global leadership, it's quite huge. So, most of the fastest growing economies are currently in Africa. And our continent, holds, I think, about 1/5 of the world's, critical mineral reserves that are essential for the global transition. And this is despite the fact that, we're still energy poor. And so what we're trying to do in the work we do is help this continent articulate an alternative development vision that delivers renewed thinking about the linkages between development, energy, and climate change, and allow us to actually propose, energy systems and solutions that are needed to power, people-centered prosperity and well-being. Because we've missed out on the fossil fuel, powered industrialization, and now we're dealing with the problems resulting from the Russian invasion of Ukraine that has intensified, the dash for gas in Africa, where a number of European governments and industry actors are accelerating efforts to expand gas production in the continent. What we're saying to a lot of the policy makers in the continent is that is not the right path for the continent. Africa must make the right choice, and the right choice for this continent is basically tapping the incredible renewable energy potential that exists. And so providing that much needed thought leadership, that much needed, endogenous ideas that will help power the Africa we want. We know fossil fuel, energy systems have caused, the adverse impact that this continent that is most vulnerable to climate change is currently suffering. And so the opportunity for us to maximize, benefits and also minimize potential harm will require us to actually make the case for a just energy transition. And so because we're on the front line and we're suffering the impact of climate change, there is value in mobilizing African agency and African moral voice so that we can help this continent leapfrog the obsolete energy systems of the past in favor of modern people-centered renewable energy and decentralized and also cost-effective, I must say, renewable energy systems. And because it's a shoe wearer who knows where the shoe pinches, if the energy poor, the vulnerable, and perhaps even in many cases the least informed is provided this very vital information that recognizes the fundamental role of energy across many sectors and as also as a critical enabler of sound economy and of social well-being, you have the opportunity not just to help with the transition, but also effectively deliver better development, sustainable development. And so because of the fundamental role energy plays and the fact that we have 70% of our population under the age of 30 and hungry for better well-being and for dignified life. It's how we actually tap these things to and help bring and strengthen African agency, help develop African ownership of the energy vision, this alternative energy vision that is so important for the continent, and integrate it in the development planning. So in the old days, climate and energy activists will come talk about why clean energy is the right thing without engaging development practitioners. And so let's breaking down these silos so that we can effectively establish clear policy priorities that carries everybody along. So providing that scope for the delivery of the transition that we want and genuinely fostering the kind of democratization we need to allow people to actually make the right choices and ensure that they can actually be able to participate in the processes that are so important in making the right choices for their future.
So important to really think about that question of the development opportunities and bringing youth and training and the voices of that, the aspiration into this discussion in order to make sure we really create that pathway that policymakers see as essential to their development. And I really am very pleased, especially to highlight the role that bringing people into this, not just from the perspective of service for people, but also to think about that training, that investment in people, and the ability for us to tap into the youth. And I want to shift a little bit now, if I could, over to Nandini, because I know, Dr. Das, in your focus is on Asia, and that big build out is already underway in many of the Asian countries, even as we know that coal has remained a predominant source of energy for much of South and Southeast Asia. There is this, as Laura put forward, these kinds of opportunities and offers on hand for whether it's a just energy transition package or opportunities to think about the type of development engagement through the private sector, through MSME engagement, supply chains. You've been watching this in your role, and I'm curious about both the questions associated with how Asia and Asian countries view this, because there have been lots of stories about the health impacts of the implications of fossil fuel for health in these countries, as well as the questions associated with where and how the economies can pivot given their role in the global supply chains and in the economic systems. There's so much that Asia can do to help deliver that clean energy transition, both internally and in their role of the world. How do you see this playing out in the context of South Asia?
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. So, I mean, energy demand in Asia is increasing like never before. So in past 1 decade, per capita energy demand has increased by 18%. IEA's report is showing that electricity generation is going to be doubled by 2035. But majority of this increase in energy demand is now being planned to met through coal, mainly. But as you know, that 8 out of 10 ASEAN countries, they have committed for a net zero target by around 2050. But at the same time, most of the South Asian countries are now dealing with a massive energy crisis. So these are like some of the situation which actually kind of enabler to moving towards renewable energy. And I mean, this is definitely going to be a defining challenge for Asia over the next decade, I think, to balance its increasing energy demand at the same time, how it will switch towards renewable energy. So recently we were in Cambodia for a stakeholder workshop and for the power system people in Cambodia, and there is a big I would say like a skepticism towards renewable energy, that how they will ensure their growth depending on a renewable energy. So the sense is coming from that I mean, in these countries, I'm talking about Cambodia, but generally in Southeast Asian countries, they are at the very low level of the development. So power accessibility is very limited. So grid planning is very important to ensure the stable supply, which Laura and Nicole both, they have mentioned in their discussion, that it is very important to have a strong grid. Laura has given example of Indonesia. So I just want to add one more example, like Vietnam. Vietnam has added like around 20 gigawatt of solar and wind capacity in past 3 years. But as their and they also introduced feed-in tariff, which again attracted the grid integration of renewable energy. But their transmission system was not ready to deal with a variable renewable energy, and they faced a massive grid failure to deal with this variable energy, renewable energy in their energy system. So these are like very much challenges which South Asia is dealing when they're thinking about energy transition. And another thing is that when we are thinking about these renewable energy projects, these are mainly requires larger land compared to like the thermal energy. So they are now located in a distant place than the load dispatch center, so which requires even more investment in development of the transmission grids. So here comes like another option, how we can repurpose the existing thermal power plants to swapping it towards renewable energy to reduce the cost of expansion of the transmission grids, because these are developing countries, and also already the question has been raised regarding the cost of capital, not enough available financial model or business model to transition away from fossil fuel to renewable energy. So these are like some cases, but when we are talking about like how to address the flexibility, it also comes with the technology readiness of the country in terms of like energy storage. And another very important thing is the demand side responses. So demand side management is not very much at this moment is not very much in practice in South and Southeast Asian countries. So this is a very important thing which is needed to be incorporated in the power sector policy development, so that this flexibility of the renewable energy can be addressed. But again, this is involved with investment, capacity development, knowledge sharing, and overall like international collaboration. And finally, like on particularly in the Southeast Asian country, one of the major challenge is that its coal fleet is really young, so around 10 to 15 years average age. And when we are talking about like transitioning to renewable energy, all these coal assets are going to be stranded. So definitely a proper just transition plan is needed to be there. So as you have talked about that JETP, Just Energy Transition Platform for Indonesia and Vietnam. So one concern is that the JETP in its current form, it's its investment should include more focus towards grid development. And secondly is that currently it is mostly coming in the form of a loan rather than grants. So again, this high cost loan could be challenging for this developing country. So maybe we need to think more about that, how we can facilitate low cost finances for these developing countries to facilitate their renewable energy transformation.
Such an important, and I just want to go back to this question of sort of the grid development, the need for us to think at that systems level, and the just transition portion of that. What does a grid look like when you're thinking about the just transition? And this is one of the questions where we've had a lot of interesting conversations back and forth within this community about the role of distributed renewable energy, about the role of storage in that, and thinking about whether mini grids and microgrids can be supportive of a complementary strategy, even as we know that grid expansion needs to happen to bring all people into the systems over time. And I want to just go back to this, the question about how then we do that. And one of our questions that we've come in on the chat, I was just noting, is around the sort of democratic implementation of strategies in various countries in Africa and what that means. What does it take to be able to develop that more just transition space? And I want to go also to worker training and engagement with workers, because one of the reasons why those just energy transition partnerships were put forward was specifically around coal and the management of coal, but certainly oil and gas as well. So we're going to take that question and move it aside for a second on the oil and gas and worker engagement. And Mohammed, if I could just turn to you for a minute to talk about that democratization and engagement as countries are thinking about how they deliver a different economy, how you bring that those needs for technology support, for finance commitments and technical assistance forward. Where do you see that conversation going, and how will you be working? I know you're part of the Act 2025 coalition. How do we bring civil society? How do we bring the voices in that help make that happen?
So the best way is for us to actually increase collaboration and strengthen unities between different players and have, a multi-stakeholder approach. You can't ensure just transition without carrying everybody along. So the more we break the silos and the more we ensure that the transition actually underpins the kind of development we want. We know energy is so critical. And so the way, at least we've approached it, is everybody wants to actually address, important factors around, development, around energy, around climate. And so what we need is a systems approach that allows us to be able to think about how do you deliver accessible, affordable, reliable, sustainable energy, but not just for the sake of it, but to help, deliver prosperity and greater well-being. And the more you think about energy as that critical enabler, the more you realize you need to actually strengthen unities across different, groups and communities, and ensure that we can actually be able to strengthen the ownership of these groups of the agenda, of the narrative, and work with a frame that integrates their issues. And so if everybody can actually see in the design of the future energy system what they're looking for, and it's easier for them to also prioritize and for them to actually be able to include it in their own planning. So that will also help facilitate the kind of stakeholder participation that is so critical. Because at the end of the day, I think for a lot of this, what we need is actually to get everybody to join us and help us actually move rapidly away from fossil fuels to renewables. And that new model of energy provision needs to actually bring into focus what the different economic sectors require. And so we need to basically open up and have a big tent approach, one that speaks to what everybody's trying to work towards in a rapidly, changing, external context. and where energy becomes the foundation of a resilient food system, of a resilient industrial system, of a resilient, health system. And the more everyone actually joins in that approach, the more you actually help democratize and the more you help strengthen the urges of people to actually help influence the direction of their development. And that is the power of mobilization. And that way you're able to actually help build pressure on political actors in a way that allows you to actually win. And so the approach we're taking in Africa is, we need to support clean cooking. We need to support the diversification of energy generation. And to do that, we need to also talk about the ownership of energy. Who owns, who designs, who owns, who profits, and is it for the good of the planet? And so these are important factors that we've tested, and that will actually allow us to then ensure the right energy choice is actually made. And so that is at least the model of an energy provision that will also help us navigate the many pitfalls of the past.
Nicole, I want to go to you on this question as well, because of course we spoke earlier about with Laura about the permitting, the engagement that we need on the build out of the system. How have you seen this level of engagement and cooperation around the challenges associated with transmission, distribution, and siting, to name a few? What would you see as the opportunity or the responsibility to integrate both voices and as well as the technologies into our planning processes?
Certainly. Well, I think at the forefront, we must acknowledge there's no real single voice or stakeholder or solution to execute this. But at the core of it is this collaboration. And it's collaboration in terms of a new style that we need. And that's something that the Bezos Earth Fund and I are really quite strong in trying to promote in the industry. And what that means is we need to think about new solutions, new different types of partners, partnerships, and most importantly, all the parties need to increase what I like to call jointly walking the talk. That means as an industry, we need to be more focused on the actual execution and increase that execution. This means that all different parties, you could be the developer, you could be the transmission line owner, the government, or the financier. You need to rethink further the model and the approach they apply to current and future execution. How you put these parts together, looking at the grid or looking at the grid and the renewables, meaning that all parties need to increase their action, both the speed and scale, but it'll also increase the innovation to design more adaptable business solutions or structures and risk profiles that match exactly directly the end system. That is the net carbon power system we're all aiming to deliver here. We need to acknowledge we're building a new system here, and hence all aspects need to be rethought in such capacity, both from an innovative and proactive manner. And if I could give you an illustration, just generally about this new style of collaboration that is so essentially important, there's a GEAP, Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet. Bezos Earth Fund is a founding partner together with Rockefeller Foundation and IKEA Foundation. And it's an example of an alliance with philanthropy. You've got local entrepreneurs, governments, technology, policy, and financing partners. But they're there to support, and it's particularly focusing on developing countries in shifting to the clean energy. But it actually is approaching collaboration from a different angle. It's re-looking at those risk profiles, those business models, and really seeing what is needed to execute. And again, not just address today's issues, but what is this end system that we're all targeting? And let's start focusing on this now and not leaving it to another day to look at. Another great factor to acknowledge, and sort of it was highlighted even through the Systems Change Lab, is, for example, corporate procurement. I mean, this is a sector that didn't exist back in 2010. I think the sector was about 0.1 gigawatt. As of last year, it's over 300 gigawatt of a sector. So everyone in this ecosystem's got a role. Everyone has got a responsibility, but also together, we've got this great opportunity to come together in different forms of partnerships, bring new sight. And instead of just bringing the old of yesterday, let's look at what we're dealing with today, but also try to bring new insight to address now what we need in the future.
I think that's an excellent, I'm smiling. You touched, of course, on one of the topics that's near and dear to my heart. That 1 gigawatt that was so inconsequential in 2010 was the work that I had done with corporations in the United States and
Oh, well
helping them
done.
build out the renewable energy work with the climate group on our green power market development group many years ago. But it is wonderful to see that we could have that type of specific actors that take forward commitments and build for the engagement to deliver something that is also in their best interest, right? We know that there is this need for them to meet their science-based targets, for corporations to meet their science-based targets, to be part of the solution, and to bring forward the strategies that enable that shift. I think that is also really important when it comes to industrial engagement and decarbonization, whether that's through low-grade temperature heat transitions away from the direct use of natural gas and fossil fuel to heat pumps, for example, which Laura touched on earlier as well, and that demand side for a clean solution. It hits transportation, it hits industry, as well as empowering the technology sector to respond to those needs. So it's so important, the levers that you've highlighted here. And Nandini, we're going to open up to questions from the audience in just 1 minute, but I want to ask if there are specific ways to create that effective shift away from this vulnerability that you spoke to around energy crisis, when we don't have as much of a fossil fuel input requirement. Are there factors towards achieving the clean energy economy that we haven't touched on today that are going to be really critical for South and Southeast Asia, given that they occupy such an important part in the global economy?
Yeah, definitely. For South and Southeast Asia, I think one of the biggest enabler for shifting towards renewable energy is the high potential of renewable energy, which is not yet been explored. So if you look at Southeast Asia, the solar capacity is around 900, the potential is around 900 gigawatt. The wind potential is around 1200 gigawatt, and very few, less than 1% maybe has been explored so far. So definitely this is our biggest opportunity for Asian, developing part of the Asia. And also many international finances are now flowing into Asian countries to explore the potential of offshore wind. So some, for example, like Vietnam, Philippines, they are developing offshore wind capacities. There is positive government policy support, and they are including this offshore wind potential in their renewable energy targets. And another thing is the geothermal, which is important for Indonesia and Philippines. They have a good reserve of geothermal, which they can explore. So, I mean, by renewable energy, you always think about like solar or wind, but it is also important to diversify within the renewable energy spectrum, because again, to address the issue of the flexibility and the variability of the energy sources. So these are like a couple of things which we can achieve in the Asian countries. And again, this is positively linked with various sustainable development goals, which is like the biggest leverage for the developing country to push towards the clean energy system. So as you have already talked about, like the health benefit from reduced air pollution from the power plants, and it's also related to the other SDG impacts such as innovation we are just talking about, development of new industries. So these are like very important source of enhancing growth, socioeconomic development in these countries. So there is a very strong linkage actually with socioeconomic developments with the clean energy transition. So we just need to focus on that, that how we can reap the most of the benefits, not only reduced emissions, but like other benefits also, which can be we can reap off. That's the thing.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, and I think that you've mentioned the sort of this idea of the multiple benefits, and I really like that idea, because it isn't just in the lowest cost power that we unlock a system, a compelling system transition. That certainly is an element of the transition that we know is critical, the cost, affordability of the technology. But as we talked about, it's that broader view of the development pathway that allows you to get at the benefits that you could actually achieve, rather than thinking narrowly, that shift to systems change. Well, thank you. I want to just thank the panelists for these responses, and it's an incredibly thought-provoking conversation. If Laura has time, I'm hoping she'll be able to rejoin us so that we can do the Q&A portion of the discussion with all of you online. And because we have a huge number of really great questions that have come through from the audience, and we will make the recording available. We will be making the questions and answers available, and I want to just recognize how important all of your participation is in this discussion, those of you who are in the audience today. And there are 3 questions that I'm going to ask our panelists to respond to, and ask that you indicate which of the questions you're going to respond to when you, and I will do a round that way. We have a question specifically around that cost of capital. What is it that it creates the changes or the differences in cost of capital? And certainly we've touched on a number of factors that, and I have my own opinions, but I'm going to wait and let you answer. What is it that influences that cost of capital and then creates the conditions for investment within a country? The second theme that we're seeing, I mean, there are many, but second of the themes that I'd like this first round to focus on is, so we've got the conditions, the enabling conditions around capital, the enabling conditions around workforce. We know that the transition from a coal-based mining workforce, we know the transition has to occur for oil and gas workers in this transition. What do we do about workforce? And then the third question that you could consider responding to is around the something we alluded to earlier, specifically in this, is every system going to be similar, or given the attributes of any country's geography, do we need to be thinking broadly about what does a zero carbon energy system look like? How much of that is centralized in a grid? How much of it is decentralized in distributed assets? How much of it is with zero carbon fuel, in the role of nuclear, the role of carbon capture and storage, those kinds of questions. So what is it that we need to do to create that pathway forward? Microgrids, mini grids, et cetera. So I'm going to actually start with Laura to welcome her back to the conversation. Laura, would you like to tackle one of those questions, or anything that those questions have raised for you?
Thank you, Jennifer. And I was listening in. I think it was really fantastic discussion you just finished to have. And if you don't mind, I would like to jump into the workforce question, as it's something that we looked in quite in detail last year, and we have at the IEA an entire work stream on just energy transitions. And maybe a couple of observations in relation to workers, because the overall headline numbers that we have when we do analysis about what does the energy transition entail is actually that we will see an increase in jobs for grids, for installation of renewables. So we have actually a very positive story about the net growth in jobs. However, there are going to be losses, even if those are smaller than the overall numbers that we create. It is absolutely imperative that those are front and center of energy transition, or any transition strategy, in particular for what concerns coal. So last year, we actually located where the millions of coal workers live today. And we analyzed country by country, actually with the location of mines. And what struck me as an incredible finding was that only 4% of coal workers today live in countries or jurisdictions which have in place what we would consider a full and complete energy transition policy. So this is a huge gap that we all together with discussing can actually bridge. And the other number that I would like to bring to, which I found incredible, is actually that 90% of coal workers today live within a radius which is between 100 and 300 kilometers from a critical minerals mine, with basically a skill set which is exactly the same. So governments today rarely bring on the table unions, workforce in general. It's an example also for the recent JETPs. In very few of those, we have had those around the table. But I think it's really something we should encourage and do with two very clearly very two important gaps. One is about introducing the right policies, and the other one is trying to understand what transition can happen, and some of it, not all, but some of it can happen within the energy sector itself.
Mm-hmm. Really important. And we'll go back to mining. I think there are several additional questions on that. Let me move to Mohammed, if you're able to come back on camera, and ask Mohammed if you would like to respond to one of those three questions.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And the one I'll choose is on the pathways and where what will actually support the accelerated, renewable energy deployment. So let me think of it from that perspective. What we need is actually to limit global heating to below 1.5. And that will require us to substitute, fossil fuels with renewables at scale. And then, so if you approach it from that perspective, we'll need, on one hand, to phase out, coal, gas, and oil, and on the other hand, to transition to renewables at scale. Now, different countries. Now, let's take the example of Africa, where you have over 600 million people without electricity. Of those people are actually in rural places, and so for them, it's going to be decentralized renewable energy solutions that will actually to help support the kind of well-being required. And so if you prioritize energy access for the poor, what you then need to prioritize is distributed community-led, renewable energy solutions. But I must say, that is not the only thing that will be required, particularly to support the kind of industrialization we require. I think we need to be conscious about what particularly our policymakers need, which is massive deployment of energy. And so there will be space for deployment of centralized renewable energy solutions. And so we need to actually be open and recognize that to be able to deliver at the scale that governments particularly require to be able to attain the industrialization aspiration, there will be other renewable energy and electricity systems that we need to be aware. And so if you look at the way currently our energy systems are structured, they wouldn't necessarily support the delivery of renewable energy deployment. And in many cases, for many of our countries, they favor fossil fuels. And so the preferential treatment of fossil fuels must be actively be redressed. And so decision makers will need to actually recognize to support the transition. We need fair and effective policy and market and regulatory conditions. And allow for planning and the permitting and the siting to actually happen bottom up with the solutions in mind, in a way that we can be able to deliver the kind of flexibility that respects, the environmental and social aspects of the transition that we're looking for. And so, because I come from Africa, it's easy for me to say, people-centered renewable energy, decentralized solutions are the way to go. But that's not necessarily the case for some of the advanced economies. But the bottom line is, what we need is a rapid transition to renewable energy systems that delivers economic opportunity for everybody. And we need to engage governments in the policy making and in the infrastructure planning so that we can actually be able to remove the bottlenecks that have held back, the deployment of renewables. And so we need to be smart about how we go about this and recognize that it's about economic growth, it's about well-being and prosperity, it's about environmental benefits and how we manage the impact. And so long as you're conscious about this and you're actually looking at the practical solutions, different pathways for different countries, depending on where they are at their development stage, and in terms of their energy access and what the current lock-in situation is. But the thing we should all be convinced, we should all be buying into is must phase out fossil fuels, must scale in renewables at scale, and there's no two-way about that. And so that is what we need. And depending on which country you're looking at, it's around how you deliver actually equitable energy system that allows us to actually realize that aspiration.
Great. Well, let's, Nandini, I would like to give you a chance to respond to those three themes that we've heard. And then Nicole will go straight to you. And then I think we'll have time for maybe one more round of questions, and I'll ask when we complete these three.
I'm going to take that distributed renewable energy question. I think it is very important to have the option of this distributed energy system. I can understand that grid connection is important, but for many developing countries, this distributed energy system is important. For example, we were in Bangladesh last month again for another stakeholder consultation. So Bangladesh is an agrarian economy, and they are very skeptical about the land availability for large solar project or large wind project. So for those sort of economics where land availability is very limited, there you can think about this. And also, like, large part of Southeast Asia is archipelago, so it's like island countries. You can't have a integrated grid system, power system in those countries. And the third thing is, I will say that also these Southeast Asian countries and other part of the world also, they are increasingly become vulnerable of the extreme events such as cyclones, hurricanes, and large power infrastructure are very, very vulnerable towards these sort of extreme events. And it also has, related to high economic cost. So in those situations, like the regions which have become more prone to these sort of extreme events such as cyclones and other storms, there also we can think about distributed energy system or like mini grid, microgrid as a solution with a reduced recurring economic cost in those regions from the infrastructure side. So these are there is not a single solution for a complex problem like this. So you have to take a case by case kind of decision, like where it is suitable and more adoptable, affordable. These are like typical criteria for a decision to make.
Really important, and thank you for that. We'll come back. And over to you, Nicole.
Also, just to build on to Laura's very good comments about the workforce, this is our chance to not just rethink the energy system, but also the kind of society we're aiming for in this new energy system, a more equitable, just society. And so the workforce is an essential part of that. But in addition to what Laura said too, we also need to acknowledge that there is a skill gap and there's a job gap to execute this energy transition. So there's a great opportunity to think smartly and innovatively of how we can reskill some of our colleagues and citizens. But also, we also need to acknowledge sooner than later that there is a gap in some of these skills to execute this full energy transition. And the sooner we can try and to address that from both the government, from corporations, from cities, from everyone in society, the quicker we can also execute this energy transition, or the lack of workforce could become a barrier to execute it at the speed and scale that we should be aiming for. And the other comment I would just add is I totally agree with what Laura was saying too about the cost of capital. I know there's lots of funding out there and there is a lot of money out there, which is great to execute this energy transition. But we also need to acknowledge that the cost of capital is not always equal globally. For example, in Africa, not everyone's aware that per unit charge of storage is 40% more than what it is, for example, in the developing world. And that's not fair. And so we need to really look at more innovative solutions of how we can address the cost of capital, but more not only an innovative, but more an equitable approach. And for example, at Bezos Earth Fund through GIAC, we particularly are looking at innovative ways in the developing world, starting off in Africa, of how we can try and sort of equalize a little bit of that cost of capital and sort of bring some innovative business models with other partners to really address some of those issues.
I think the panel has hit on this need for a broad view of what the enablers are for systems transformation. And the systems transformation has to reflect the characteristics and challenges of that society. And so I think we've highlighted here through all of the panelists, this interplay between the connectivity on the technical side and the technical solutions that are necessary, the opportunity to bring investment into economies to help empower the pathways that are accessible to those economies to help meet the multiple needs. And then finally, or not finally, but in addition, the need for the assets of the business community, of the government policy-making community to see this broader multi-attribute system that we're trying to build as they look at what might appear to be power sector transformation agenda, but it certainly doesn't rest. The decisions don't rest within the power sector alone, the utilities, the energy ministries. This is a much broader whole of society transition. And I think you've all articulated that so powerfully today through our webinar. We are 1 minute out from closing. And what I love to do at the end, and I apologize to all of you who've been on panels with me before, is to give you the opportunity to offer one word of advice. Going into COP28, what is your one word of advice? You have to keep it within what used to be the Twitter 140 character limit. One word of advice to all of those on our call who have amazing questions in the chat that we've not been able to adequately address or in the Q&A portion. One word of advice to policymakers, to civil society leaders, to technical solutions companies, and to all of us who care so deeply about this topic. We're going to start, I think, with Nandini for her one word of advice, and then Nicole to you, Mohammed, and then Laura, you can close us out with your one word of advice.
Focus on well-being to shift towards as a leverage towards moving towards renewable energy. Sorry, I'm a bit like jumbling of the words, but yeah, so human well-being and strong linkages towards with the SDGs are key to success. Yeah.
I would add to that everyone has a role in executing this global transformation of the power system. And we need to really focus the industry's attention more on the speed of direct execution.
Mohammed, one word of advice.
Yeah, COP28 is actually the moment in which the world can actually strike an outcome and a decision that delivers a quick and a just phase out of fossil fuels. And that's what the world urgently needs. But to actually land that and win it, we need to also accelerate the deployment of renewables. And so the ball is in Al Jaber's court, and I think we can actually get the ball rolling in Dubai, and I can't think of a better place to strike that deal than in a petro state. So let's push for that together.
Laura.
I could really say one word, that is ambition. So we want to see raised ambition for 2030. Double intensity, triple renewables, get emissions of the oil and gas sector by 2030 cut by half, and put the money on the table. Ambition.
Thank you all for joining this call. Thank you to my panelists, to Laura at IEA for the fireside chat, and to the Systems Change Lab team and WRI team that made this conversation possible. We have our marching orders, and we thank you all for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.